Hello and welcome to this video linking to your graph work today, which is going to show you how to take a set of data and turn it into a bar graph. Now this might be helpful as a starter guide to see how you might put it together. I've also said to you that you can make a graph in the style of Mona Chalabi, so you might want to dismiss certain things which I've gone over in this video, but it should help you think about spacing for your axes, and just show you kind of the thought process, at least my thought process, when going and creating a graph. What you're going to need is you're going to need some squared paper or some sort of equivalent. You're going to need a ruler, a pencil, and a set of data. Those are the things you're going to need to make a graph. I've got already, as you can see, I've got my set of data at the bottom there, the same one that I had on the question sheet. I'm not using a ruler for obvious reasons, but I've got everything I need. I've got my grid and my squares. As I've said elsewhere, I do recommend using squared paper with smaller squares, so you get more squares on a piece of paper, just because it gives you more freedom to choose between different scales. Okay. Alright, let's get started, shall we? Okay, so the first thing that we need to think about, really, is our x and our y axes. So if you remember, we have the y-axis, which goes the vertical line, and we have the x-axis, which is our horizontal line. Where this comes into play here is that we need to decide from our table of results which one is going to be y and which one is going to be x, so we know what we're plotting along which line. If it's me, typically, I mean it really doesn't matter, but typically I would go for the labels, the categories that we are including as our x-axis, and then I would use any numerical values, so any data that you recorded by measuring time or length or whatever, as your y-axis. You don't have to, and there's an example on the challenge sheet of where they've done it the reverse way. It's, with a bar chart at least, it's kind of irrelevant. However, that's how I'm going to choose to do it. Now, the second thing I need to decide, now I know which one's going to be my x, which one's going to be my y, is how long to make my lines, and it's where we start to talk about intervals. So an interval is a space between two things. I'm going to start with the x-axis first. My thinking here already is I have got 1, 2, 3, 4 categories for my x-axis, so I only need enough for 4 things along my line. I'm going to start in the corner here, so that I'm not starting in the middle of the page, so I haven't got enough space, and I'm not right up on the edge of the paper, so I can put in my labels later. I've got 4, so I'm going to do it as maybe 3 squares is going to be 1 label. No, 3. So I need 3 lots of 4 squares to go ahead. So that's 3, that's 1, 6, that's 2, 9, that's 3, 12, that's 4, because that's 4 lots of 3 there. So I've got my line in. So my thinking here then is that I've got my 0 here, and then every 3 spaces, every 3 squares, I can put in one of the people from my table, which I've decided is going to be my x-axis. If I'd done 4, which I could have done, that might have been a nice way of doing it. I think I might have just run out of space, because 4, 8, 12, 60, yeah, I wouldn't have had enough space, I would have run off the edge here. So I've also got to think about the width of my paper. But that's fine, that should work perfectly. So I can do mum on that one, dad on this one, me, and I'm just going to put brother on that one. There, that's my x-axis set up. I can't do anything else at the moment, but I've measured along how far I think I need it to be. I'm using the squares as a guide, and it's given me enough space. I've tried to make the spaces, the intervals between each category even, because that just looks nice. You could, of course, do them unequal intervals, but it It just doesn't look very nice, that's all. We're thinking of a better presentation at this point. Okay, now we can start thinking about the y-axis. So the same thing we need to think about. Because we're dealing with a data series, we've got to think about, are we going to go up in ones? Are we going to go up in tens? Are we going to go up in 20s? You could go up in 50s, you could go up in hundreds. I mean, you could go up in any interval you choose. Looking at my data is the important thing. So I can see the numbers on this side. The smallest number is 134, and the largest number is 192. If I decided that my intervals were going to be, so 1 square was 1, then I'm going to need a lot of squares to get all the way up to 192. It's going to be a really tall graph, because it'd be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. You know, I've not even reached 20 and I'm at the top of my piece of paper. So thinking about the fact I've got large numbers there, I'm not going to use ones. For a similar reason, I'm going to avoid the twos. I'm going to start looking at 2-digit intervals, things like 10s or 20s, maybe 50s. I'm not going to go for the hundreds, because if I went 100 and then 200, all of my data would have to squeeze in between here, and it'd be really hard to tell what the differences were. They'd all look roughly the same, and it's not very helpful for our graph. So you can go too high with your intervals. So I think a 2-digit interval is probably the right one. I could do, it's either 10s, 20s or 50s then. I think 10s would be nice because it might show some of the differences in data between where they're close together, so 167, 165, because we'd see that more clearly. I think 50s for the opposite reason would be less useful, because it'd be more difficult to see the differences between them. So 10s or 20s, and what's going to really determine that here is how many squares I have got. So if I go up in 10s, I've got 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. I can already see there that I'm almost at the top of my page, so 10s isn't going to help me with the size of paper that I've got that I'm working with. So I'm going to have to use 20s, I think. So if I were to use 20s, how many squares would I need? 40, 60, 80, 100, 120, 140, 160, 180, 200. So that seems to be a scale that I can fit in, at least on my piece of paper. 20s, again, I think 10s might work a little bit better for this, for showing the differences, but I'm working with what I've got, and that's the same that you have to do when you're at home. You've got to work with what you have. Great. I've put dots out to help me remember. I'm going to draw a line over the top of that. I'm fortunate enough that I can draw a line and then erase my dots, whereas I don't think you can at home as easily, but you could draw smaller dots. I've drawn mine larger just for the sake of your ability to see. Of course, you might want to label up your axes. That's always a good suggestion of mine, so that people know what the intervals are, so they know what they're looking at. Great, okay, so I've got my y-axis ready. I would need to label it, so that would be height, and then you need to include the unit of measurements, which is centimetres, because that's what we're working with. Now, as you can see, I've put the graph close to the edge of the paper to try and save space for the x-axis, and I've lost a bit of space on the y-axis. Yeah, it happens. I wouldn't worry too much about it. I'm sure you could probably do a neater job than me like that, but it is worth thinking about when you start to plan your graph about that placement. Great, okay, so we've got our x-axis all labelled up, we've got our y-axis all labelled up, with a title. I didn't put a title on the x-axis, so let's do that now quickly. So that should be, it could be anything. You could have people, you could have members of family, my family. Done. Now this is the part where we need to draw in the data. So my first one is 167. So the first thing I would do is to come up here and find out where 167 is. I know that halfway between 160 and 180 is 170, so whatever I draw has to be just underneath. So I'm going to put a little dot there. It's got to go across to the edge of where I've drawn this line here, dividing mum and dad. So it's got to come across to here. And I may as well put in the other lines up here just to remind me for the others, although they may not be that tall. Can only come that far across. Because I'm on the first one, I don't have to draw the line on the left because I've already got my y-axis there, so I can actually just draw the lines going across. Alright, so I think 167 is about there, so I'm going to draw straight across. This is where your ruler comes in really handy. I'm using a special key to keep it straight, and I'm drawing it up to that red line because that's where I need to stop. Now, it's up to you whether you now draw from the x-axis going up or from this line going down. That's entirely up to you. I think I'd probably start from here and draw down. Drawing along the blue grid line, that's what it's there for, to help you, until you get down to the x-axis. And that's where you should end up with a nice little bar, which you can then fill in later. My personal preference is to draw the bars first and then do the colouring in afterwards, just because that way you've got your bar completed and you're not going to worry about your colours. Let's get the job finished before we worry too much about anything else. Alright, moving on then. So the next one is Dad, 192 centimetres. So again, a similar thing's going to happen. I'm going to come up to my y-axis. I'm thinking I know 190 is halfway between 200 and 180, so whatever I draw is going to be very, very close to that 190 line. I put a tiny little dot there to help me out. Now, this time round, when you're drawing your line, you may want to start off from the y-axis because it's more helpful. That's what I'm going to do. But you are going to want to draw it very, very, very faintly so that you can rub it out later. So I would draw it faint, 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 faint. Ooh, I've hit that line now where Dad starts. So I might just start pushing a bit harder. Push harder, 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 stopping when I reach that blue, which I've marked out as the edge of Dad. So although I've ended up with a big thick line like that, you should end up with something more like this. Let me just. Okay. You should end up something a little bit more like that. And that faint line that you drew to start with, you can erase afterwards. Of course, that also means you're going to need to draw in some other lines. So I'm going to have to draw a line coming down to join up these two, and I'm going to have to draw the line coming down to join the top of the Dad bar down to the x-axis line. Perfect. And that is how I would put that graph together. You've got a few bits and pieces left to do. For example, you might want to give it a title. I decided to do the titles for the x and y axes first as we went along because it's just easier that way. But you might want to give it a title of heights of people in my family. Doesn't have to be a big fancy title. Just needs to tell you what the graph's showing. So heights, ooh, that's a terrible. There we go. Heights of people in my family. Now it is a bar graph, and we do like a bit of colour. So this is the point where you could add colours to your bars. I think I'd like different colours to make it a bit more interesting. So I'm just going to very roughly do different colours for different people. You could, if you were doing one based on your family, you could do one that's their favourite colours for each one. That would be pretty cool. If you're going for a Mona Chalabi style, then then I would suggest doing something different. In fact, you might want to draw out the bars and then maybe create a picture inside. So maybe I'll do that for the last one. Maybe I'll draw a picture of my brother. So then you sort of had the height of the person as a picture of them. I mean, this is very crude and quick drawing, but I'd have to be very careful to make sure I haven't done it here. I'd have to be careful to make sure that I kept the height that was required by the bar, because otherwise you're going to have a different reading. So maybe then this is me, dun, 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 dun. And you could have it however you liked, really. So yeah, that might be a more Mona Chalabi style, make it a bit more fun.